2 centimeters. That is how far parts of one of the largest cities on Earth drop every single month. Not over a decade, not over a year, every month. And it does not stop. Mexico City is not flooding. It is not eroding from the coast. It is sinking, straight down, into a lake. A lake that was drained 500 years ago, paved over, and built on top of. 22 million people now live above water that was supposed to be gone forever. It is not gone. It never was. And everything you have heard about why this city is sinking is missing the one part that actually matters. Here is the story most people know. A giant city, a shrinking water supply, climate change, bad planning, the ground gives way. It is a sad story, and it is the kind of story you forget by the next morning. The problem is that almost every piece of it is incomplete. So let us take it apart, one piece at a time, and find the thing underneath. Start with the most basic claim. People say Mexico City is sinking because it is running out of water. That is backwards. Mexico City is sinking because of how it takes the water it has. Roughly 60% of everything this city drinks is pulled up from an aquifer directly beneath its own streets. Pumps run day and night, dragging water out of the ground to keep faucets working in 22 million homes. And every liter that comes up leaves an empty space behind. Now here is the part that turns the whole thing strange. The ground under Mexico City is not rock, it is clay. Ancient lakebed clay, soft and waterlogged, laid down over thousands of years at the bottom of a lake. The kind of soil that behaves like a sponge. Picture that sponge soaked full of water, holding its shape only because the water inside is propping it up. Now squeeze it. The water leaves, and the structure does not bounce back. It folds in on itself. It stays folded. The clay beneath this city is doing exactly that. The empty pores collapsing under the weight of everything built above, compacting tighter and tighter year after year. And here is the cruel detail. It is permanent. Even if every pump shut off tomorrow and the rains refilled the aquifer, the ground would not rise. The compaction is one way only. What sinks stays sunk. So the city pumps water to survive, and every act of survival presses the ground down a little further. The thing keeping 22 million people alive is the same thing dragging them into the earth. Pause on that. The water is not the victim here. The water is the trap. In the worst hit zones, reports describe the ground dropping more than 40 centimeters in a single year. Across less than a century, parts of this city have fallen by more than 12 meters. 12 meters. That is a 4-story building, swallowed by the soil, in living memory. A geophysicist at Mexico's National University put it plainly to the Associated Press. They have, in his words, one of the fastest rates of land sinking anywhere in the world. And now something is watching it happen in real time. In July of 2025, a satellite called NISAR went into orbit, a joint mission between the American and Indian space agencies. It can measure changes in the surface of the Earth down to the centimeter, fine enough to catch a city sinking at the speed of a growing fingernail. Between October of 2025 and January of 2026, during the dry season, when the pumping runs hardest, it turned its radar onto Mexico City. The images came back painted in false color, deep blue marking the zones that had dropped fastest, and the blue was not a patch here or there, it pooled across the historic center. It spread under the residential districts. And it sat, dark and unmistakable, over the main international airport, a hub where tens of millions of travelers a year touch down on runways that are quietly settling beneath their wheels. From space, you can now watch one of the great cities of the world being slowly pulled into the earth, month by month, like time-lapse footage of something that should take centuries. So that is the mechanism. The city drinks itself downward. But this raises a harder question. Who built a megacity on a sponge in the first place? And to answer that, we have to go back 500 years to the moment someone looked at a lake and decided it should not be there. Before there was a Mexico City, there was Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec world. And it was not built beside a lake, it was built inside one. On islands in the middle of Lake Texcoco, a vast, shallow body of water filling the floor of the valley. To anyone arriving for the first time, it should have been impossible. A city of 250,000 people, standing in open water, with no solid ground beneath most of it. But it worked. It worked because the people who built it understood something the conquerors never would. They did not fight the water, they farmed it. They built chinampas, narrow rectangles of fertile soil raised just above the surface, anchored by living willow trees whose roots stitched the islands to the lakebed, fed by the rich black muck dredged straight from the water. Floating gardens, people call them now, though they did not float so much as grow out of the lake like the city around them. The harvests were astonishing, several crops a year from the same plot, enough to feed 250,000 people on soil that was, technically, not land at all. And the streets between them were water. Canoes moved through the canals at night, gliding in the dark to reach the markets by dawn, before the tropical sun turned the day to heat. A boatman could load his produce at dusk in a town across the lake and arrive in the capital with the sunrise. And they controlled the water with engineering that should make a modern planner uneasy. They built long earthen dikes that ran for kilometers across the open lake, separating the brackish, salty water on one side from the fresh water they needed on the other, a wall that held two different lakes apart inside the same basin. They built aqueducts to carry clean spring water from the hills into the heart of the city. They built wide causeways that doubled as flood barriers and could be cut, like drawbridges, to stop water or armies alike. Every year the rains came and the lake swelled, and every year the system absorbed it and held. For 2 centuries, a city of stone and gardens stood in the middle of open water and did not drown, not by luck, by design. Then, in 1521, it ended. During the siege of Tenochtitlan, the dikes and aqueducts were destroyed, and they were never rebuilt. The conquerors took the city, leveled its temples, and made a decision that would echo for the next 500 years. They would not learn the old system, they would erase it. They would build a European capital on the ruins, on solid streets and stone plazas, as if the lake had never existed. There was just one problem. The lake still existed, and without the dikes that once held it back, it did what water does. It came in. The new colonial city flooded again and again. One flood in the early 1600s kept much of the city underwater for 5 straight years. 5 years. People debated abandoning the site entirely and starting over somewhere dry. The authorities refused. Instead, they did the only thing their worldview allowed. They declared war on the lake. They would not live with the water. They would drain it. And here is the inversion that should stop you cold. The Aztecs were never the primitive ones in this story. They were the only people who ever solved this place. The conquerors did not improve on the system. They demolished the cure and spent the next 4 centuries fighting the disease. Over generations, through tunnels and channels and canals, they pulled the lake apart and pushed it out of the valley until almost nothing was left. The bottom of Lake Texcoco, that soft waterlogged clay, dried out and became the foundation of a growing city, which means the ground this metropolis stands on was never meant to hold a city. It was the floor of a lake. And the modern city, by pumping out the last water trapped in that old lakebed, is finishing the job the Conquest started, draining the lake to the very last drop and sinking into the dry hole it leaves behind. You can see the evidence without any satellite. You can see it standing in the center of the city if you know what to look for. Walk into the Metropolitan Cathedral, the enormous stone church the Spanish began raising in the 1500s on the rubble of the Aztec temple it replaced, and something feels subtly wrong before you understand why. The floor is not level. Walk from one end of the nave to the other, and you are quietly walking downhill. One corner of the building sits noticeably lower than the rest, because the ground beneath it gave way faster. For decades, engineers fought to keep the whole structure from tearing itself apart, even drilling beneath it and carefully removing soil from the high side so the sunken corners could catch up, deliberately sinking part of the church to stop it from cracking in two. A building so heavy, fighting ground so soft, that saving it meant helping it sink more evenly. That is the absurd arithmetic this city now lives by. Then there is the monument that gives the whole thing away. The Angel of Independence, a golden column raised in 1910 to mark 100 years of Mexican independence. When it was built, it stood at street level, a short flight of steps leading up to its base. Today there are many more steps than there once were. Crews have added them over the years. And here is the part people get wrong. The monument did not rise. It did not grow taller. The ground around it sank, meter by meter, leaving the foundation stranded high above the street until they had to build new steps just to reach what used to be ground level. The angel is not a monument to independence anymore. It is a ruler measuring how far the city has fallen. This is the second inversion. The city is not sinking around its monuments. Its monuments are the only things standing still and they are quietly recording how far everything else has dropped. Every added step is a year of the ground giving way. The angel did not climb, the city fell out from under it, and the falling is not gentle. The clay does not sink evenly, like an elevator going down. It compacts at different speeds in different places, depending on what sits above it and how the old lakebed was layered below. So the ground does not just drop, it tilts, it twists, it tears. Cracks open across roads and race up the walls of houses, wide enough in places to slip a hand into. Water mains snap underground, hemorrhaging the very resource the city is killing itself to extract, so that some of the water pumped up at enormous cost simply vanishes back into the broken earth. The metro, one of the busiest transit systems in the Americas, runs through tunnels that bend and warp as the ground beneath each section settles at its own pace, forcing constant, expensive correction just to keep the trains running level. And in the worst pockets, the surface drops so unevenly that a building leans like a ship listing in a storm, door frames turning to parallelograms, and the only way to save it is to gut the interior and prop up the historic face while everything behind it is rebuilt. There is something almost unbearable in the daily reality of it. In neighborhoods on the eastern edge of the city, in districts like Iztapalapa, where the sinking is among the worst in the entire metropolis, residents wait for water delivered by truck, hauling it up in buckets and storing it in rooftop tanks because the pipes beneath them have cracked or run dry. And they do this while pumps a short distance away pull water out of the same ground at full force to feed the wealthier center. Picture it. People rationing what they catch from a truck, standing directly above an aquifer being emptied around the clock. Their own neighborhood sinking fastest precisely because the soil there is the softest and the pumping nearby is heaviest. The water shortage and the sinking are not two separate crises competing for headlines. They are the same machine, viewed from opposite ends. The deeper the city drinks, the lower it falls, and the people at the bottom of that equation are the ones with the least water of all. And the people in charge know exactly what is happening. That is what makes the present moment so strange. The current president of Mexico is, by training, an environmental engineer. Before leading the country, she was the mayor of Mexico City itself, from 2018 to 2023. There is no ignorance here. No one can claim they did not understand the science. The sinking has been measured and documented for a full century, since the first engineer flagged it back in 1925. So why does it continue? Because of the third inversion, the one that has no clean answer. To stop the sinking, you would have to stop pumping the aquifer. But stop pumping the aquifer, and you cut off most of the drinking water for 22 million people. There is no version of this where the city simply chooses to stop. The act that is destroying the ground is the same act that keeps the population alive. You cannot fix it without breaking it. You cannot save it without emptying it. Engineers talk about bringing in water from distant basins, recharging the aquifer, capturing the rain that now runs straight off the concrete and into the drains. Every solution is real, and every solution is slower than the sinking. The ground is not waiting for a budget. It drops while the plans are still being written. The Aztecs lived with the water. They built a system that held for 200 years. The civilization that replaced them decided it was smarter than the lake, drained it, paved it, and is now being pulled down into the empty space where it used to be. 5 centuries later, the water is still winning. It is just doing it slowly enough that an entire city can pretend not to notice. And here is the thing that should keep you up at night. This is not only a Mexico City problem. Around the world, cities are pumping their aquifers dry and sinking into the gaps. Coastal megacities, river deltas, capitals built on soft ground that someone, somewhere, once decided to ignore. Mexico City is just the clearest case, the one falling fast enough to see from orbit. It is a preview, not an exception. They did not build a city on a lake. They built it on the grave of one, and the grave never stopped settling. So here is the question to sit with. When a civilization decides it is smarter than the place it conquered, how long does it take before the place collects what it is owed? And are we watching that bill come due, one sinking centimeter at a time? If a city that erased a lake 500 years ago is still being dragged down by it today, what exactly are we burying right now that our descendants will have to answer for? Subscribe to Impossible Lands and stay with the places where the ground itself remembers what we tried to forget.